This is Larry Taunton, Executive Director of Fixed Point Foundation, a Christian think tank based in Birmingham, Alabama. You're about to hear a fascinating discussion between Professor Richard Dawkins and Dr. John Lennox. Let's talk a little bit about the new atheism, Richard.
Not my phrase, by the way.
Not your phrase.
Isn't it your phrase?
No.
Do you know where it comes from?
Tell us a little bit about that phrase.
I have no idea where it comes from. No, I presume it was some kind of journalistic invention.
That's interesting. I thought it was yours.
No.
As we think of the so-called new atheism, would you say that 9/11 was a touchstone?
I'm rather bad at reading the zeitgeist. I'm not sure quite what touchstones are. I think what you're probably talking about is 3 or 4 books that came out roughly the same time, around about 2005, 2006, 2007. And I suppose it's not unlikely that there was a change especially in America as a result of 9/11, but I think also as a result of the Bush presidency, which is increasingly being seen as a disaster by the entire world. And I think that a sort of backlash to that may have contributed as well.
John, how did 9/11 affect you, if at all?
How did it affect me? Well, of course, it shocked me. And I think that I would want to say, having read Richard's books and other books, I share this reaction to extremist fundamentalist religion that leads to suicide bombings, and I can understand a very strong reaction against it. I was interested, Richard, reading the Spiegel article. You were interviewed by Der Spiegel, and they seem to think that all of you, that is Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dan Dennett and yourself, felt very much that one of the big springboards for writing these books was 9/11. I think it's very important.
I think it's very important to make a distinction between saying that all religious people are evil, which of course none of us would even think of saying. So it's nothing to do
surely.
with that. I think it's what it's about is the feeling that faith, since it doesn't require evidence, since it doesn't require a defense, you just simply say, that's my faith, and that's the end of the argument. Faith can be used if somebody is so inclined to use violence, then you can justify your violence by faith. I think it's even probably true to say that the 9/11 hijackers were actually righteous men. I mean, they actually were good men in the sense that they believed passionately in what they were doing. They thought it was good. It was, of course, deeply evil
in the eyes of their religion, yes.
But in the eyes of how they interpreted their religion, they thought they were doing the will of Allah.
But that's the danger as you see it.
Exactly.
Because it's not thought out and it has no rational basis and so on.
What worries me is that if you don't allow in a rational basis for what you believe, then it's possible for people to say, well, I'm sorry, I just believe that Allah told me to go and kill all those people. And it's no good arguing with me because argument's not what it's about. Faith is what it's about. And that, I think, is the danger.
Now, one of the things that greatly interests me about this, now I'd love to understand it, I really would love to understand it. In my own upbringing, in my own thinking and so on, I have never equated faith with absence of evidence and so on.
Well, that's fascinating.
Now you're and it's great that we have a chance to talk about it, not in front of a vast public hall, because that's very inhibiting to proper discussion sometimes. But reading your books and trying very hard, maybe I don't try hard enough, but I try very hard to get inside this. I can understand a person like yourself or like myself watching the 9/11 extremism or the incidents in my own country, or anybody that says God is on my side, therefore I did it because God said it. I can understand that as telling me that blind faith is extremely dangerous. But where I think we differ, and where I'd love to understand where you're coming from, believe me, is this, that I was brought up, and I understand it from my own perception of the New Testament, that is not what the Christian faith is. That's dangerous, that blind faith. But all faith is not blind faith. And just as you say, have faith in the scientific method, and so have I, I have faith in God and believe that it's evidence-based. Now, of course, I might be
yes,
wrong
well,
about
that's
that.
what we want to get on to then. I mean, what is the evidence?
But it's that concept of faith as a commitment that's based on evidence that's central to my thinking. Yeah. But is it true, and this is my question, is it true that in your experience you've come across so many people whose faith is just reason shut down, I believe it, I can't discuss it, I won't. Is that your general experience?
I'm not sure it's a matter of experience of people. I think it's rather that if what you believe is based on evidence, why bother to call it faith? I mean, why not just say this is an evidence-based belief, just like a scientific belief, in which case the onus is on you to provide the evidence.
But that's true at the personal level. I mean, we actually mentioned in the debate, if you remember. I have faith in my wife. I call it faith. And it's trust. It's based on evidence and it's belief. I don't see this incompatibility here at all.
Well, I wouldn't accept that it's... I think the case of your faith in your wife is based on evidence.
Yes,
and
that's
I think
right.
That's fine.
So there can be evidence-based faith.
I wouldn't call it faith, therefore.
You wouldn't call it faith?
I wouldn't call it faith. I would say I have evidence. You could say I have evidence that my wife loves me. It will be a very subtle kind of evidence. It'll be...
Yeah, sure.
It won't be scientific evidence. It'll be...
But it is real evidence.
It's real evidence. It's little looks in the eye, little catches in the voice, little deeds of kindness, long shared history together, all those sorts of things. That is evidence.
On which you base your trust, which is your faith.
On which you base your trust. But I can't see the point of using the word faith as opposed to evidence, where evidence actually is something that you can say, this is the evidence. I've seen my wife, I've talked to her, I've listened to her. In the case of God, what's the equivalent of that?
Before we come to that, let me try and get this out a bit further. Let me try and give an analogy. Sir Richard Dawkins, who is a great friend of both of ours, I think, discovered the link between lung cancer and smoking. The evidence is all in. Now, there are people who read that evidence, but they don't commit themselves to it. They still smoke. They see the evidence there, but they're not committed to it. There's no trust in that evidence. Does that begin to make any sense to you? It seems to me that we can still speak of faith where the evidence is as objective as Sir Richard Dawkins produced. There are people that don't trust it or don't act according to that evidence.
Well, there's certainly people that don't act according to it, and they might say, well, I can see that the evidence is there, but I'm going to take my chances, I'm going to go on smoking anyway. There are people who have a sort of wishful thinking, and they desperately want to go on smoking, and so they blind themselves to the evidence. I don't think it's a very fair analogy. I think that if you are going to believe in God and talk about it as being the same thing as believing in your wife, then you need to provide the same kind of evidence.
Oh, I agree. Well, the same kind of evidence in the sense of as closely as you can get. I agree with you entirely, which is why I would want to say, when asked for evidence, I would say there are two kinds of evidence for God. There's what I call the objective evidence and the subjective evidence. Under objective evidence, I would come first of all to the scientific evidence, as I would call it. That is the fine-tuning in nature, the very fact that we can do science, that the universe is rationally intelligible, seems to me to be both coherent and consistent with the notion that the primary thing in the universe is a mind, is God, rather than being matter and energy. So it seems to me that you've got a very coherent and consistent piece of evidence there. That's where I'd start. I certainly wouldn't start with the subjective. And then in between, there's the historical sort of evidence, which is not quite scientific, but isn't anti-scientific. I don't think science covers everything, and I don't think you do either. But the evidence, in my case as a Christian, for the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. And then finally, the validation of it in my own personal experience. So that all of that adds together, it's cumulative evidence. And it all counts as evidence.
We discussed the scientific evidence, what you call the objective evidence, in our discussion in Birmingham. And we can go back to that if we wish.
Yeah, sure.
The second point you made about being a Christian and evidence for the resurrection and so on. I'm curious whether, as a scientist, do you actually believe in the resurrection?
I do, yes.
As a fact, you really
I do
believe.
indeed,
What about
yes.
the virgin birth?
I do. I believe in that too.
You see, I mean, that's what I find quite astonishing.
Do you?
It's one thing to produce a sophisticated argument about the fine-tuning of the universe, and I don't accept that argument.
No,
but I can see that it's an argument that's well worth discussing. It's interesting to discuss. But how you can go from that to believing that a man was born to a virgin? I mean, can't you see that astonishing sort of mismatch between the sophistication of the scientific argument on the one hand?
I'm very pleased you brought this up, because I noticed at the end of our debate you were almost shocked by the fact that I'd mentioned the resurrection. I think you made this point. You know, we've had this sophisticated discussion and now we come down to the resurrection. There seems to be a mismatch. Well, let me try and explain why I don't think there's a mismatch. Why I think actually it's the other way round. I don't, first of all, see it as a mismatch at the conceptual level. That is, I don't think science excludes the possibility of miracle, granted that there is a God. I think our understanding of the laws of nature, brilliant as it is our understanding and codification and mathematical formulation of what normally happens. But if there is a God who is ultimately responsible for the regularities of nature, then, as I understand it, he's perfectly at liberty to feed a new event into the system. It's not, by definition, to be explained in terms of the laws going on at the moment. The virgin birth is, or virgin conception to be more accurate. And that's interesting, if I might just focus on that. The most detailed record of the birth of Christ was given to us by a doctor, Dr. Luke, who presumably was trained in Alexandria, and shows an immense sophistication at the beginning of his what we call his gospel, his life of Jesus, because he actually goes to the heart of the objection that you raise and many other atheists raise. He tells us not the story of one miraculous birth, but of two. The first one was of John the Baptist, where his father was an elderly priest and mother an elderly priest. And this priest is in the temple, he's praying, so he believes in prayer, he believes in God, and in an angel, so the story goes, tell him he's going to have a child. And he says, don't be ridiculous. I'm paraphrasing now. I'm too old. So he knew as well as we do the law of gynecology that says there comes a certain age where you can't have children. Now this shows me that Luke is perfectly aware of this kind of scientific objection. Now the interesting thing is he tells us of the conception of Jesus, and then in medical terms he gives us the 9-month period between conception and birth, which is interesting because that's a law of nature. You can virtually predict to the day when a child is born after conception. In other words, what I think happened is God feeds something new into the system, and in that sense nature takes over and a baby is born 9 months later. The big thing is, of course, can one believe that the eternal God can code himself into human DNA? That's what I believe happened. And I don't think science is against it. Science makes it very surprising. So I will want very powerful evidence for the fact that it actually happened. I will sit with you on that. I want very strong evidence that it happened. But I believe that it is the only explanation that makes sense of who Jesus eventually turned out to be. The virginal conception was not the thing the early Christians went round shouting about as evidence. They preached accessible evidence, that's the resurrection, not the virgin conception. But if we grant the resurrection, which I know you don't, we can come to it in a moment, then the virgin conception makes sense of the, I admit it, colossal and stupendous Christian claim that the Word became human. But I'll stop there because I know you want to come back on that.
It sounds to me like the most abject special pleading because you want to believe something. It's When you say you demand you would demand especially strong evidence, well, rightly so. So would I. And what is the evidence? The evidence is a couple of documents which are admitted to be derived from a mistranslation from the prophet Isaiah. And that's it. I mean, why on earth would you betray all your scientific principles for that?
Well, I don't. Half a minute. There are separate things here. The alleged mistranslation from Isaiah. It's very interesting, actually, there that the Isaiah was produced, of course, in a conservative Jewish background, and the one word that conservative Jews would not have used if they didn't really believe this is what they were inspired to say is the word that's used there. So I understand. The evidence for the virgin, that's just a question of tying it in with prophecy. It's the actual claim of the New Testament, quite apart from Isaiah, that the Word became human, or, as Paul put it sometime later, that in Christ the whole fullness of the Godhead dwells bodily. That claim is all over the place. Christ made it himself. I am from above, he said. Now, clearly that's utterly mad and deluded and lunatic unless it's true. So I go back to it. I need strong evidence that it's true. And a lot of the evidence comes with the resurrection of Christ itself. But I don't know about special pleading, because I could never have made a story like that up.
Well, lots of people made stories up. I mean,
well, they do.
Lots of the gods of the ancient world were born of virgins. It's one of the commonest myths around, and the Jesus myth just took on one of those myths.
Well, that again is an assumption. And why the special pleading argument gets us nowhere is I could accuse you of exactly the same thing, you know. It's special pleading. You say this is just one of those old myths. It's the same kind of myth, and you want that to be true. I want to say that the New Testament was not written in that kind of mythological language. And the thing has to do with the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, which is a historical claim. And I'm interested in what you have felt when you've interacted with the evidence given, say, by serious contemporary thinkers like Bishop N.T. Wright or somebody like that on the resurrection. I mean, do you feel there's just nothing in it at all?
Nothing at all, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, why would I, given that the historical evidence is so incredibly weak? You know very well that charismatic figures, it doesn't take 2,000 years. I mean, it can take only decades for myths to grow up. Extraordinary myths about myths about Elvis Presley, for goodness sake. I mean, these myths grow up. John Frum of the South Sea Islands.
I know, but
you should take seriously.
But I take it seriously because of the cumulative evidence of history, and because, in one sense, my life and my worldview depends on it being true. I have spent a lot of time investigating it and trying to take the opposite, your perspective. You know, assume it's false. And we have therefore to explain a number of things. How, for example, did an evangelistic movement suddenly explode from Judaism, which was not known at all and still isn't, for its evangelism at that time of history? There are the events surrounding the grave, the empty tomb, the reports, and so on and so forth. And the more I investigate them, the more solid they appear to be. And this is very strong evidence.
What about Hume's view of miracles? I mean, you're deliberately setting up. You're saying you treat as more plausible a miraculous account, whereas Hume would come in and say, surely the idea, I mean, if you're really, really saying the fact that Christianity has spread is evidence for anything, isn't it rather more parsimonious to think that Christianity spread for some other reason, like it was adopted by the Roman Empire or something like that?
Well, no, not really, because of the nature of the claim itself. I mean, I've read David Hume, and that could lead into a very... I used to think that Hume had a really serious objection to the miraculous until I started to read him himself, and I don't think he has at all. And I have, in fact, tried to investigate the New Testament witnesses using Hume's criteria for witnesses. It's a document I could perhaps pass on to you sometime, but I'd be very grateful for what you think of it. Actually, through the eyes of Hume, sitting down and looking at that. And I think here we have something that was very public in the Roman Empire. And Christ was regarded as dangerous. That's how he was represented to the authorities. Religion is dangerous. And was accused of stimulating revolution. That meant that there was a public trial and his claims were taken seriously. Pilate exonerated him from those claims, and Pilate wanted to make jolly sure he was buried and gone. Now you come and discover this claim that he rose from the dead. If the body had been still around, the authorities could have put paid to such a claim in a few moments, but they didn't, because they couldn't. And so with the way in which historical investigation goes, we can approach it from various angles. And the more we approach it from those angles, the stronger the evidence appears to be.
It sounds like the sort of conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination, about the death of Princess Diana, and all sorts of different
But
people.
who's to conspire,
No,
Richard?
I didn't mean conspiracy in this case. I meant that even something so recent as the death of John Kennedy, as the death of Princess Diana, the death of Marilyn Monroe, all kinds of myths grow up. And the one thing we don't do, if we've got any sense, is say, Kennedy was killed by a miracle or something like that.
I know we don't.
You don't do that.
No,
and why
we
do you
don't.
do it about this particular case? Because you've been brought up a Christian,
No,
is the
not
answer.
at all. Not at all. Yeah. Initially, probably yes. Initially, probably yes. But I don't know whether I've mentioned this to you before. This was my big question when I came to Cambridge. When somebody right early on said to me, do you go to church? And then I said, oh, sorry, of course, you're from Ireland. They all go to church and they fight about it, you see. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it raised your question, is this just Irish genetics, brainwashing, heredity? And so from that day on, I decided I would spend a lot of time with atheists. And I've been doing it all my life. And it's been by exposing myself to atheist questioning and trying to see it from their viewpoint, and therefore being very critical, I hope extremely critical of my faith, that I've come to these conclusions. Now, your comment on conspiracy theory interests me, because the very first theory that was put around by the Jewish authorities was a conspiracy theory, that the disciples had conspired and they'd stolen the body while we slept, which is very curious. And very weak. So that was going around, but they couldn't produce the body. So the question is, what happened to the body? I think there's no use in comparing it with Diana or Elvis or anything else. Firstly, because each has to be taken as own merit. But secondly, Christianity is no small thing. And throughout the centuries, there have been millions and millions of people now, millions believing don't make a thing true. But as a phenomenon, it has been enormous. And also, as a phenomenon, I would want to say for good, and you would probably question that, it has been enormous. But I go back to, I think there's an intellectual coherence, and I find that the evidence is immensely strong, but we must consider the actual event itself.
Well, I mean, Islam is immensely strong. Immensely,
it is.
And I mean, all sorts of myths grew up around Muhammad. He split the moon in half. He ascended to heaven on a winged horse.
Yeah, that's right.
I take it, do you believe that?
No, I don't.
But why not? I mean, it's just...
Because I don't think there's evidence for it.
Well, there's not evidence in either case. In both cases, these are myths that grow up around charismatic figures, as they always have, and they still do.
No, because Jesus, you see, when he died, the disciples were totally disillusioned and thought it was finished. I don't think we'd ever have heard anything more about Christianity. The central claim, remember, of Christianity, the central claim was that Jesus rose from the dead, and these people in the early apostles gave their lives believing it was true. Now, that leaves open only two possibilities: that they were deliberately deluding people, or they were themselves deluded.
But don't you think that either of those is more plausible, using Hume's argument?
No, I
is more
don't, because...
You actually prefer a miraculous explanation
It's not a question of
to the idea that people could be deluded.
No, it's not a question of preference, Richard. It's a question, I don't think those explanations work when you follow them through to their logical conclusion. For morally, for men to perpetrate a delusion when they die in the name of truth and honesty and integrity and morality, that doesn't make sense. Secondly, if they were deluded, by whom were they deluded? I think we need to look at the actual
deluded
details.
Men have always sacrificed themselves. I mean, we just talked about the hijackers of 9/11. They were deluded. They sacrificed themselves. They believed totally that they were doing the right thing. They were deluded. Why shouldn't the disciples of Jesus have been deluded?
I think we need to differentiate between suicide bombers who kill a lot of other people with themselves and people who are themselves tortured and put under enormous pressure
of
to
course we do,
recant
with respect to the wickedness of them.
Their faith. That is exactly right. Now, if they're going to do that when they know that, when they themselves know it's a delusion, the hijackers, you see, believed it. But these people, if they had actually constructed the appearance of a resurrection, of course, we would want to ask as well why on earth you'd want to do that. But if they had done that, they would have known it. This isn't a question of deluded people. This is a question of people perpetrating a delusion, which is a very different thing. So we need to separate those two.
You made two possibilities. You said either they were deluded or they.
Yes, that's right. That's right. We need to consider them separately.
To pick on the second of those. But what about other miracles? I mean, do you believe in the changing water into wine and raising of Lazarus and things like that? Yeah. You believe all that stuff?
Well, let me be very clear. I believe in we call them miracles. They're often called signs in the New Testament. Those particular things that are in the New Testament, yes, I do. Why? Because if you've come to the conclusion that Jesus is who he said he was, that is, he is God incarnate, the Word become flesh, he rose from the dead, then the fact that the Creator, remember, the claim I'm making is perhaps even bigger than you realize. What I'm claiming is this: there are two worldviews. There's your worldview, which is, as I understand it, an essentially materialist or naturalist worldview. The universe is self-explanatory in terms of matter and energy and the laws of nature and so on. So that matter energy is essentially primary in the universe. And mind is a development after a long process, wherever. Whereas my claim is that it's the exact opposite way around. Mind is primary in the universe. God is the ultimate reality. Everything else, including you and me, is derivative. So that means that here's the claim. Let me set it out. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. All things were made by him. So I'm claiming that whatever mechanisms that were used, and we can tease those out scientifically, and that's the fascination of science, ultimately, it's the mind of God, the Word of God that's responsible for them. Now, if God becomes human, rises from the dead, then things like the Creator turning water into wine or raising Lazarus, they are the easier things to believe, provided you've got the first framework in. I don't find difficulty believing those, because they were not simply ends in themselves. The water into wine you mentioned, for example, done at a wedding. The wine had run out. What does Jesus do? It's the very first sign he does, says John. And what does he do? He brings the joy back into that wedding. And how does he do it? He takes jars with water in them that were used for the religious ceremony and were finished with on the side. And he brought them into the middle. If you imagine yourself there, you would imagine groaning, gosh, the wine's run out and now he's going to bring religion back into it. Catastrophe. But what Jesus did was a miracle at one level. That is, there's something supernatural about it. But it's an acted parable at another level. That is, he made out of the chilly water of religion something that the people were glad to drink. And it says he showed his glory. That is the kind of thing he'd come to do. The resurrection of Lazarus is simply, but it's a foreshadowing of what will happen on the large scale one day. And I believe in the resurrection of the dead. So it seems to me these things are not arbitrary, like the kind of things you refer to in your book, I think, weeping statues and all that kind of thing. I'm very skeptical about those. But the miracles in the New Testament, yes, there's a consistency about them. Does that make any sense to you?
No, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean,
I'm sorry.
It looks to me like a sort of conjuring trick, a rather cheap variety. I mean, we've all seen conjurers on the stage.
But that's what it's not.
Well, I know you
there
believe
are
it's not.
relatively few of those. You see, if it was a conjuring trick, you'd expect conjuring tricks all over the place, wouldn't you? This is something, to my mind, absolutely marvellous, because it, as I say, shows that Jesus is the creator, but also shows something of what he's come to do.
Well, you've drawn out a symbolic meaning. I don't understand why you don't do what most vicars and bishops do, which is say it is symbolic. That's all there is to it. It never happened.
Yeah, I know they do that. That, to my mind, is the tragedy. But I think it's a both and. It's like the resurrection. It actually happened, but it also has a great symbolic and layers of metaphorical meaning as well. It's both and.
Well, when you say you don't believe in the weeping statues and things, obviously, nor do I. And you're perfectly happy to write off the evidence of thousands of witnesses, as indeed am I. Why don't you write off the evidence of?
I listened to the witnesses. It's Hume again in one sense. It's the credibility of the witnesses, and I just don't find the same credibility. Nothing near the same credibility. I mean, one of the things that really influenced me as a student, Professor Sir Norman Anderson, a very eminent professor of Islamic law, incidentally, in London, who was a Christian, which is another very interesting thing. But he, as a very senior lawyer and a QC in his own right, he wrote a little book that I read at Cambridge on the evidence for the resurrection from a lawyer's perspective. And it was that was a touchstone for me. This was of an intellectual dimension, many categories higher than I'd come across before, laying out from a legal point of view how a forensic expert would approach this. And it's simply a difference. You see, I am so with you, Richard. That's why I resonate to your book. Evidence, yes, evidence. But then what I can't understand is why you can't see that on the Christian side there is evidence, and I wonder what that is the result of.
Well, I mean, the evidence of the Gospels
is it the people you've met? Or
no, I mean, the evidence of the Gospel has been looked at by biblical scholars, New Testament scholars, who've concluded that there's nothing in it at all, and you want to believe it.
But that's I don't know what selection of biblical scholars you've got. That's a very I mean, you mentioned one in your book, and you talk about Jesus belonging to the in-group morality of Judaism. I think it was John Hartung or somebody, but he's not a biblical scholar.
He's not a biblical scholar, but
it surprises me that
Bart
you
Ehrman, for example,
don't look at some of the top people around today. But I know you have very little time for theologians, but there are a number of scientists who are no mean scientists around who believe the resurrection, like John Polkinghorne, with whom
does
you may
he
have
really?
Discussed it. Oh, absolutely. John does, yes.
Gosh, okay.
And so does Francis Collins, who I believe you
Seriously?
know. Yes.
Okay, I thought better of them.
They must, sorry?
I thought better of them.
But do you not see that it could be, when you say you think better of them, do you feel I'm sort of committing a scientific suicide when I...
Yes, I do. I thought that people like, well, shall we say serious theologians, would have said about something like the water into wine or the virgin birth, this is a symbolic, it's a parable, it's an allegory. Of course, we don't believe it literally happened.
No. I want to say it is a parable, an allegory, but I believe it literally happened.
Okay.
Yes,
but where do you stop? I mean, you presumably don't believe the book of Genesis literally happened. And if not, why not?
Well, what do you mean by the book of Genesis literally happened? When it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, I do believe that.
Okay, what about the world was created in 6 days, Adam and Eve, etc.? You don't believe that?
Well, do we want to have a look at it? Yes, I do, but I would want to explain what I mean by it.
All right.
Because the famous 6 days, you see, seem to me, on looking at them carefully, to be this is a very sophisticated chapter. Why do I say that? Because the word day has 4 meanings in that short text of around 100 Hebrew words. And it is written in such a way that I would want to say that it doesn't imply that they were the 6 days of one earth week, which is an assumption that many people make. I just feel that's wrong. I have no difficulty with... I think you and I would agree on the age of the earth. But again, I don't think Genesis is saying anything against it. What it's saying is, in the beginning, God, whenever that was, it doesn't say, 13 point whatever, 0.8 billion is it now? Something like that. And then there is this sequence. Now, this sequence, when you look at it, there are a series of 6 steps and then a 7th day on which God rests. And curiously enough, I find that most Christian theologians think that rest is still going on now. God's not creating anything. He created and he's rested from creation.
Let's go back to the 6 days, shall we?
Yes. Yeah. So you have a sequence of 6 days. Day 1. It's not the first day. It's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. The 6th and the 7th. There's a definite article in Hebrew, no indefinite article. And the fact that it's put on just 2 of them and not all of them shows that this is not just a simplistic all the days of 1 week. I would want to say, and you may disagree, but I would want to say it's patient of a variety of understandings, one of which is this: God speaks. He speaks again. He speaks again. A relatively limited number of speakings, 5 or 6, and then that stops. And so there's the architect of creation speaking. Presumably it didn't take God long to speak. Then in between those days, there are long periods of settling down where you have the potential being outworked by things like natural selection and so on and so forth. So I don't find myself wearing my Christian hat constrained by the text to say this is 6 days of 1 week, therefore that's ridiculous, so we can forget it.
No, you don't.
I don't know.
I don't know why you bother, because when you think about where the book of Genesis comes from, when it was written, when was it written? About 800 BC or so? I mean, not that long ago.
No, probably a lot earlier than that, and that is just what the exciting thing is. I was speaking to quite an eminent biologist not long ago who'd picked up Genesis, and he said, how on earth did they know these things? The few things that are said in Genesis so long ago. I think that's the astonishing thing. Let's put it in this perspective.
Like what? I mean, what was an example?
Like what? Well, the thing we began to discuss, and you got the audience laughing at in Birmingham. You know, for centuries, if we'd been sitting here a few centuries ago, we'd have believed in a fixed earth with everything rotating around it. Both of us would. We'd have been Aristotelian, probably. But the Bible for centuries had been saying that the universe was eternal, that there was a beginning to space-time. It was only in the 1960s that the evidence began to come in for that. And you know that people like Maddox of Nature, Sir John Maddox, resisted it, because he said we can't go for this big bang, this beginning thing, because it gives too much leverage to people who believe in Genesis. So it seems to me that there is fascinating confirmation. For centuries, this text, ancient text, has been stating that there was a beginning.
There are 2 reputable theories of cosmology in the 20th century, the steady state theory and the Big Bang theory, of course. And one had to be right and the other had to be wrong. It seems to me extraordinarily unprescient to get one right out of those 2, especially since it seems to me almost intuitively the thing that one would be most likely to go for. I think most of the mythologies of the world, not just the Genesis one, most of the mythologies of the world, all over the world, have gone for some sort of definite beginning when the gods or God or the Great Spirit...
Yeah, but science didn't believe it for centuries. That's the interesting thing.
Which side... Well, I mean... as I say, you toss a penny, as I said in Birmingham, you toss a penny, you've got a 50% chance of being right.
Yeah, but
it's not impressive.
But we don't toss pennies about this. We don't toss pennies. It's like the destroyer moving along. It's very hard to shift it. Paradigm shifts are very, very big things, as you know, in science. So, although I take the point that there's one chance of 2, if you look at it from a probabilistic point of view, nonetheless, it was right about that. And I think we should want to say as well, the Bible I do not regard as a scientific textbook. That is, it concentrates much more on the intentions of God, the purposes, not on the hows and the mechanisms and so on. It says relatively little about those. That relatively little I find interesting. And the big things are, in the beginning, God created. The statement in John's Gospel, the primacy of the word and information, all things were created. And to my mind, that makes enormous scientific sense in an information age, that information is primary and matter and energy are secondary.
Well, that's an interesting thought. But why do you bother who wrote Genesis?
Because
some scribe in the Babylonian captivity. What's so special? Why would you expect a scribe to have some kind of insight into the origin of the world, which happened, as you say, the universe 13.8 billion and the world 4.6 billion years earlier. Yeah. Why would you expect a scribe to know that?
Well, I wouldn't expect every scribe to know that, but it brings us to another dimension of this, that I also believe, perhaps I'm making my sins even worse in your eyes, I also believe in revelation. I believe that God is capable of revealing to people things, and so that the Bible is a revelation of God. And that's actually what I would logically expect if God is a person. I mean, I can't know anything about you at all unless you reveal it. I can study you scientifically till I'm blue in the face, and I won't know a thing. But you could reveal things about yourself. And I believe God is revealed. So that's the astonishing thing. He revealed to people long ago things they couldn't have known. And one of the things that is staggeringly obvious about Genesis is that it's not like the myths of the ancient Babylonian world. Its sun and its moon are simply light bearers. They're not gods. It's very much deified in that sense. So I do believe that there is such a phenomenon as revelation. But that's part and parcel of the bigger picture.
I can't really believe that if the scribe had had this revealed to him, he wouldn't have made a better job at telling us about evolution, for example.
Yeah,
I mean, why not?
But Richard, I could look... I mean, it's very funny you say that, because just the other day I was saying, gosh, if I'd been writing Genesis, I'd have written a great deal more about science. But what fascinates me is, here's this very short text. The bit of it that deals with creation is very short. I mean, if you or I had been writing it, well, if you'd been writing it, you'd have written it 400 or 500 pages long and done it brilliantly. Because one of the things I admire about your capacities is the capacity to communicate in writing is wonderful. But it's not done. But one of the very interesting things that is done is this. You mentioned Adam and Eve earlier. One of the things, according to Genesis, they are told is to name the animals. That's a mandate for science. I mean, taxonomy is, in your field, vastly important. But in all of our fields, we spend all of our time, or a lot of our time, mathematicians included, naming things. So here's a mandate for science. So to my mind, Genesis, far from being anti-science, is pro-science. You get on with that. I'm not going to do that, says God. You, Richard Dawkins, get on with studying various aspects of the universe. And surely that's one of the things that you have very powerfully emphasized in your books, inculcating a sense of wonder and developing a curiosity. Well, that seems to me that God has encouraged us to do that rather than writing the whole thing for us.
Cultures all over the world have named their animals. It's obviously very important that they should do so. And one of the impressive things is how taxonomies in various primitive peoples are similar to ours. So naming is certainly a human function, which a lot of humans do. But I don't know why you're bothering to say this. I mean, it's not impressive evidence that there's any truth in Genesis.
Well, why do I bother to say it? Because I think there's so many caricatures of Genesis around. Let me just recap. I'm not claiming that Genesis has a vast amount to say about science. It has very little to say about science. It has a great deal more to say on the purpose of the world and the really big questions. Science is only part of the scene. But what it has to say, it seems to me, is very positive rather than very negative. And I want to say that in the context of people who are saying that religion in general and Christianity in particular, anti-intellectual or anti-science, are and so on, because I believe the exact opposite. That really is the point. That's why I bother saying it. I think it's important to say it.
But we got into this because we were talking about things like the miracle stories of the New Testament.
Did.
And then I said, well, what about Genesis? And you said, do you believe in Genesis too? That would lead one to believe that you believe in Genesis in the same sense as you believe in the story of the
No, I think we have to be more sophisticated. Look, literature has to be taken on its own grounds. We can't be wooden and literalistic. I mean, if I put it crudely...
exactly. That's why I'm asking you why you accept the water into wine. Why do you take that literalistically?
Because that is the impression I get from the whole text, the context, etc., that there are these... It's a multi-layered thing. It's not a simplistic thing. And so, why wouldn't I? The resurrection is clearly... Well, I think you actually mentioned it in the God Delusion. It either happened or it didn't, where neither of us are postmodern, thank goodness. Well, we believe it either happened or it didn't. So here's the historical base. This is the substratum. It's not everything, but it's absolutely crucial, you see. And particularly the resurrection, it's crucial to establish the fact that death is not the end. I mean, this is the exact opposite of materialistic philosophy. So far from, to my mind, you see, these things are as big as the fine-tuning, all that other stuff that you said we could have a sophisticated discussion about. I think it's possible to have a sophisticated discussion about these things as well. But we can't have it if our only grid is a very wooden, literalistic one. I mean, when Christ said, I am the door, he didn't mean he was made of wood.
Well, I mean, I'm not the one who's being literalistic. I mean, you're the one who's being astoundingly literalistic about the New Testament. I'm just astonished. I mean, I'm used to talking to vicars and bishops who will say, oh, it's all symbolic, it's all allegorical, and they indeed pour scorn on me for suggesting that there are Christians who take it literally. I'm sitting face to face with one who does.
Yes,
I mean, you're bearing out all the things that I'm accused of saying about Christians.
I'm glad you've got more armour then.
Well, in all fairness, John is expressing an Orthodox Christian view, a historic Christian view.
I regard this as Orthodox historic Christianity,
I'm
Richard.
sure you do, and what you're doing is bearing out what I say all the time. And I get slapped down for saying it by bishops who say, oh, that's not my kind of Christianity. They all say it's not my kind of Christianity. And I say, well, go out and look at Christians and you'll find it is.
I would question...
And John is just... reinforcing that.
I would question whether such vicars are Christians.
We get worried about the bishops in the Anglican Church, Richard, I'm afraid.
Into my hands. You're playing into my hands.
Well, I'll happily, in that sense, play into your hands if it will correct that impression. I mean, I'm amazed that bishops can, with the New Testament in their hand, and profess to believe in Christianity and not believe that the resurrection happened, because without that I would be in the atheist camp straight away.
They will say something like it's symbolic of the belief that life goes on.
But what's the it that is symbolic?
Well, don't ask me, ask them.
Okay, I'll ask them. Well, I have asked some of them.
Well, gentlemen, may I suggest we take a brief break? We hope you have enjoyed this lively discussion between Professor Richard Dawkins and Dr. John Lennox. I'm not a professional interviewer, far from it. But this much I've learned. There's a time to get out of the way and let your guests speak. After listening, I think you'll agree with me that this was one of those instances. Like the debate, it leaves us wanting more. Perhaps we can follow up this discussion with one that focuses on the other issues not here covered. Morality, meaning, and the atheist's position on both. Two things immediately struck me about this conversation. First was its collegiality. John's jovial nature is evident throughout, and Richard, though more serious, was respectful and, I think, genuinely interested. Second was the fact that it seemed like the first time Richard Dawkins had ever heard someone defend the Christian faith from an orthodox position. John explains the nuances of biblical literature, offering the historic Christian interpretation on the person of Jesus, creation, the virgin birth, the resurrection, and so on, while Richard listened and occasionally prodded with questions, fair questions. This conversation complements their earlier debate very nicely, and it was, in my view, just that, a conversation, not a debate. Finally, I want to express my thanks to both men for their willingness to work with Fixed Point. John Lennox is a friend of the Foundation and has worked with us on a number of occasions. As for Richard Dawkins, let me state very clearly that while I disagree with his atheism, I am, after all, a Christian. I found him reasonable, friendly, and easy to work with, and for that, I'm very grateful.